Mum and Dad had been fighting again the night it happened. It had become a usual thing, and since there haven't been any parent-teacher conferences lately, I don't think it was about me, so I didn't care. But tonight it seemed really serious, because I could hear their screaming, even when I turned the front room TV all the way up. It was annoying. Then, Mum started shrieking really loud, and just as suddenly, she stopped. I didn't hear anything else for a while, until my dad came out about an hour later. "Turn that fucking thing down," he demanded in the voice he always uses when he's really angry. I paused it, annoyed because the commercials were almost over, and turned to look at him. He didn't look like he usually did when he was angry. He looked sad about something. His eyes were wide, and he was shaking like he was going to cry. "Listen to me, Chris," he said, looking past me. "Your mum and I have just found out she's very sick, so she has to stay in bed for a while. She doesn't want you bothering her, okay?" "Okay," I replied. He didn't say anything else, and just stood there. After a minute or so, I got bored and unpaused the TV. I watched cartoons for a few more hours, before I got hungry. Dad had left his spot since then, and I found him in the computer room typing something. I asked him about dinner, and he told me to fuck off. So I made a sandwich all by myself and went back to watch more cartoons. Dad never told me to go to bed, so I stayed up all night on the couch. Around 5 a.m, he came back into the front room in his coat and opened the door. He was carrying a suitcase. "I have to leave for a while, to get your mother's medicine," he said, not turning to look at me. "Okay," I replied, but he left before I could even finish, slamming the door behind him. As his car drove away, I decided I should get ready for school. I took my time, because the bus didn't come until 7. After getting washed and dressed, I made myself breakfast and decided to pour a bowl of cereal for Mum too. I knocked on her door and told her breakfast was ready, and heard a shift in the bed, and figured that she must have been awake, so I left it there and went outside. School was long that day, because I got really tired around noon, and all my teachers yelled at me for falling asleep in class. When I got home, Dad still wasn't there, so I decided to take a nap. As I walked to my room, I noticed that the bowl was still there, untouched, and got upset. I decided that trying to be helpful was dumb. I fell asleep immediately and woke up starving. I didn't want to have to eat another sandwich for dinner, and looking at the time, I figured it was probably still early enough to order a pizza. Dad was still gone, but I figured that Mum could still do that, even if she was sick. I went to her bedroom door and knocked. The bowl was gone now, so she must have been awake, but she didn't answer. I was a little fed up, so I just decided to open the door. The lights were off in the room, but there was a little bit of moonlight peeking through the curtain, and from that I could see Mum's silhouette sitting on the bed facing away from me. She turned to look at me as I fumbled for the light switch. "Mum, I know Dad said not to bother you, but can we get—" I paused after I found the switch and flicked it upward. As light filled the room, I saw that the space where my mum sat was now completely empty, and she'd been lying in bed. I stood in silence for a bit, confused. I could have sworn I'd seen something there. I was going to say something when she suddenly rose up from the bed with a loud gasp. She sat slumped down for a moment, and I wasn't sure what to do. "Hello," she said finally, but something was off about her voice. She turned to look at me and smiled. "How are you, Christopher?" Her face was off, I could tell immediately. Her head tilted at an odd angle, and her eyes didn't meet mine. They were glossed over, and seemed to roll around as she moved. "You're not my mum," I stated. She was silent for a moment before she chuckled. "You're a perceptive boy, aren't you?" she asked. I guess, I answered, shrugging. Who are you? I'm nobody you need to concern yourself with, my child. Not Mum, answered back, no longer trying to replicate Mum. Her voice began to change. It got lower as she spoke, to the point that she sounded more like a man, and then not like a person at all. Where's my Mum? Your mother isn't here anymore. Something bad happened to her, so I'm using her body for a bit. Not Mum explained. Oh. Not Mum laughed again, though her lips moved weirdly in a way that made her look like an animatronic. I must say, child, you're taking this all in far better than I expected. I looked down at the floor, suddenly feeling awkward. Dad says my brain is broken, I said. It was one of the things him and Mum thought about. Was it? Not Mum asked as she stood up. She looked even more awkward standing as she lumbered forward towards me, her knees kept buckling. Her head bobbled from one side to the other, and she could never seem to keep it straight. Well, if it's any consolation, you won't have to hear anything like that anymore, Not Mum said, as she leaned down and put her hand on my shoulder. Her touch was so cold that I shivered. I'm going to have a talk with him. Okay. Can I come with you? I asked. I'm afraid not, she answered with a smile. It's personal. And besides that, you have school in the morning. You'll be all right staying in here by yourself tonight, won't you? I guess so, I replied. Good boy, Not Mum said before rising back to her feet. I could hear her legs creak as she stood upright. And don't tell anyone about this, will you? I won't, I said, figuring that nobody would believe me anyway. She smiled and walked out into the hallway. I stood and watched her until she left out the front door, and then sighed before going into the kitchen to make a sandwich. The next morning I got called into the principal's office, and when I got there I was greeted by my aunt and uncle, as well as a police officer. They all looked sad, so I figured out what was going on before they even told me to sit down. The officer told me that my parents were dead, and behind him my aunt had started to cry. He said that their bodies had been found in a motel room 3 states away, and said I was going to be taken in for questioning. My aunt was still crying as they drove me to the police station. I always knew he would get her killed, she spat angrily. Anna, please, my uncle mumbled. Not in front of Chris. You saw what he did to her, she cried out, before crumpling back into a ball on the passenger seat. We don't know what happened yet. Calm down, please, my uncle begged. The next few days passed in a blur for me, as I was pressed for questions by both police and family members. When they realized Mum had been dead longer than Dad, I told them he'd left that night with her, saying he was taking her to the hospital. They said he'd strangled her, and her body was found in the motel bed, looking peaceful. My dad was a different story, and one that the police still weren't sure of. Nobody would tell me the details, but I've eavesdropped on my aunt's phone calls enough to learn the basics. He'd been torn apart, she'd said. Someone, or something, had managed to tear the motel room door off its hinges and attack him. Bits of him were scattered all around the room, and most of his stomach had been hollowed out. They still didn't know what happened to his hands. My family wasn't interested in finding out the details, though. As far as they cared, he was a murderer who got what he deserved. So I never told anyone about that night. Besides, it's like I said, trying to be helpful is dumb.
Hello listeners, if you enjoyed this story, please check out the author in the description. For more content, leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more sinister readings.